For me personally, this is the most complete Marlowe I've ever encountered.
If he didn't die in Deptford, then the way that one reads his life is very different.
The Shakespeare authorship question exists, and it does, for want of a different phrase, it does get people going.
Good evening. Thanks for coming to the British Library on this hot and sultry evening. What better thing to do on it with such an evening than talk about Shakespeare, the poetry, authorship, and much else besides.
Silence surrounds the men of deepest faith, and listened to may call a man to prayer. I pray that no one follows us tonight, that in England rural keepers of the peace are kept bewitched by corpse and candlelight. I pray those men are instantly believed who, having played my dark and murderous friends, have stayed to stay the executioner's hand. I pray my soul's absolved in all the lies that tumble slick as herring from their tongues. I pray, my friend, you're warm and safe at home, that doors remain unkicked and truths untold, and we have silence when the daylight comes.
Is this a different Marlowe to the Marlowe you thought you knew?
I didn't know Marlowe at all. I don't think anybody does. I mean, he's a late 16th century writer. I mean, in what sense can you know him?
Did you set out to create a different kind of Marlowe to the traditional conception that we have of him?
Well, he had to be different if he didn't die at Deptford, because when I was doing the primary research, it seemed to me that the common conception of Marlowe, if people know anything about him at all, and Will rightly says a lot of people don't, but if anyone knows anything, they think, well, he's that hot-headed young man who died in a tavern brawl in Deptford. And he's characterised by most of his biographers as rather violent and perhaps a little foolish. The only unambiguous evidence for violence is actually contained in that Deptford incident, and if it was a staged fight and he wasn't the aggressor, then he's potentially a gentler character who's been badly read and misunderstood, and that was what I wanted him to be trying to tell his own tale through, was that the injustice as he realises the way he's being represented, as he begins to get slight traces of the rumours following his death, and he's rather outraged at the idea that he'd died in a brawl. It wasn't quite how he wanted it to be characterised. No, I don't think we can know Marlowe. We can only construct him for ourselves. But
Don't you think the primary construct is the plays, in fact? And what's sort of remarkable about the plays is, of course, they mostly feature an incredibly strong and potentially violent central character.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that the kind of mythos of Marlowe as a kind of violent and unruly person actually comes from the assumption that embedded in the plays.
Well, I think that the violence of that death has been used then to interpret the plays, because the plays of Marlowe are no more violent than the plays of Shakespeare. Look at the end of Hamlet and how many bodies are strewn across the stage, but people call him gentle Shakespeare, and they don't think of Shakespeare as a violent man. If you put something in a book, it doesn't mean, or in a play, it doesn't mean that you agree with it or that you tend that way. You can be depicting it in order to criticise that point of view.
What can we actually know about an author, and where do we look? Can we find an author in their fictional work, shall we say?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think completely. I mean, I think all good fiction is what I would call psychic autobiography. I mean, what writers, I think, tend to do of all kinds is infuse their fictional works with their spirit or their soul in some sense. And what they do is they take that and they apportion it to fictional characters, and they divide it up and they mutate it and they put it in. The question is, what is the key to unlock the extent to which an author's, how do you know what psychic truth is represented in the work, how it corresponds to a physical fact about the given author? And really that is much more difficult, I think, to untie. And there's, of course, an entire industry devoted to doing just that. I think reading, I don't think you get quite the same feeling seeing plays staged, but anybody who reads, I think, and reads attentively and reads receptively, feels that they encounter writers in the text, that it is, it's what Martin Buber would call an I-thou relationship that occurs in the textual reading. But I also think that kind of good readers, and there are clearly all here tonight, aren't often that much concerned with the personality, the contingent aspects of that personality, what their gender, what their ethnicity, what their class. That's why great works of literature speak to us across time and place, isn't it? It's because we enter an intimate relationship with somebody, but we don't really need to know who they are in their particularity.
Does your Marlowe come out of the works then?
Well, my Marlowe comes out of the works of Marlowe and Shakespeare. I had to take the entire canon into account, sort of make it the canon of one man, see it as a development. And so, I mean, Marlowe's works are very concerned with religion. There's a very, and he's addressing something that was a very dangerous subject. You were strictly speaking, not allowed to write about two things. One was the succession and one was religion. And he dealt with issues of succession in Edward II. He dealt with religion rather dangerously in Dr. Faustus. And he was playing with taboo things. And I would say, if you look at it as the canon of one person, you see Shakespeare still being interested very much in succession in particular, always in taking on the history play that Marlowe starts with Edward II, and then there's a lot of history plays obviously in Shakespeare. But he's much more careful in the way he couches things, and he doesn't touch on the religious thing at all, because that was really Marlowe's downfall. That was the seed of his undoing. So that's the writer I have here.
Given that we can find the author in their work, this might sound a bit of a crass question, but I'm going to go with it anyway. What does that book say about you?
I'm not sure we know how much of ourselves we reveal, or what aspects of ourselves we're revealing. And the thing that got me, the thing that made me think I want to tell this story, was the idea of being the greatest writer of all time, the acknowledged genius of world literature, but particularly English literature, and not getting any credit or recognition. And I think, there I was a writer. I had a couple of poetry books out, but I understood that sort of yearning to be recognized for writing well. That doesn't really happen if you write poetry, because it doesn't really sell. Not that many people are interested in it. The sort of torture of writing great works and not being able to put your name to them was the thing that drew me in. So I suppose that's the thing that, and the other aspect probably is the longing for someone lost, someone that you can no longer connect to. That was something that I very much tuned into.
From what I understand, many Shakespearean scholars have some questions about Shakespeare's Catholicism. Whereas, of course, the question is, with Marlowe is the inverse. At the very least, he might have been a kind of proto-Unitarian, and at the most extreme, nothing wrong with that, I'm a bit of a proto-Unitarian myself, and at the very worst, he might have been an atheist.
Yeah.
How do you square that with your coextensive, hybridized Marlowe character, or Shakespeare, or whatever you want to call him?
Well, I would say...
Because I buy the Catholic theory for Shakespeare.
Well, the Catholic theory comes out, as many things in Shakespeare scholarship do if you look into them, it actually is a sort of reaction to the authorship question. Without addressing the authorship question, it's trying to explain, why is he so secretive? Why does he never sit in a pub holding forth? Why does he not mix with other writers? Why does no one report his opinion? Why is he so discreet? And then a document was supposedly discovered in the attic of one of the houses in Stratford that is supposed to be John Shakespeare, his father, which is supposed to mark him down as a Catholic recusant. That document has strangely vanished. So there is no actual physical evidence of this. An important document in Shakespeare studies that doesn't exist, which I suggest might have been made up or might have been a fake, and once discovered then has to be lost. There is no evidence from the plays. If you look at the works of Shakespeare, find me the Catholic in there.
Ooh, I think it's full of them.
But you can always, yeah, but the
I don't think
characters,
it's. I don't think it's
characters.
I mean, you have to bear in mind the period. The point is, the people who are religious, ideological zealots in this period are Protestants. You know, the Catholics. You know, the Counter-Reformation is underway, but it's not really underway in England in quite that way. It's not so much that he's a Catholic in the sense of being ideologically a Catholic. He just is of the old religion. It's why the plays are so devoid of religious ideology, in my view, because he's not of the Protestant and ideology. What they're very much about is customary forms of belief.
For a long time, he was considered a very secular author, and the idea that he's a Catholic is now being read into the plays, but what he mostly invokes is the old gods, the Roman gods, you know, a sort of a pantheism. Right, he doesn't give you a Catholic universe, nor does he give you a Protestant one. He depicts, so, you know, it's not obviously the work of a Catholic writer, and if it had been, we would have come up with it before. The Catholicism is very recent, and it comes out of biography or supposed biography, rather than, and as I say, an explanation for absence, an explanation for secret behaviour, rather than from the plays. You can take the plays and you can read anything into them if you want to sort of impose a Shakespeare on it, which is often done, but there's no strong pro-Catholic bent there at all.
You can see why they sat me in the middle. Now, in Ros's book, as you may have guessed, the idea is that Marlowe wasn't murdered, that he in fact went into exile and then was responsible for the plays of Shakespeare.
Anti-Stratfordian, non-Stratfordian theories have been around for easily 150 years, a bit longer. Marlowe came onto the scene about 1895 in a novel, funnily enough, by Wilbur Ziegler called It Was Marlowe. But I didn't know anything of it until I saw a documentary by Mike Rubbo, who's an Australian documentary filmmaker, and that was on BBC 4 in their Shakespeare season, so it's all the BBC's fault, really.
How convincing do I find the Marlovian? Totally unconvincing, yeah. But that's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't make me enjoy Ros's amazing, marvellous. I can't think since Vikram Seth of anybody actually publishing a book-length poem, and narrative poem in quite this way. So, you know, muzzle top. It's a fantastic thing to do. On the Shakespeare authorship question, I wouldn't say I was an anti-Stratfordian, but I might be a kind of agnostic Stratfordian. But there's a difference between being an agnostic and saying, well, actually, I believe it was Christopher Marlowe, or I believe it was, you know, the Earl of whoever, or, you know, there has to be, I think that's the point at which something's happening psychologically in people, where they say, no, it's not Shakespeare, but it's X. I do think there's also something going on both with Stratfordians and anti-Stratfordians.
That's what I was going to say. Isn't something happening psychologically with someone who thoroughly believes that Shakespeare Stratford wrote them with no doubt, even though there's no primary source evidence, nothing from his lifetime, in a way it's quite extraordinary, because Diana Price surveyed 25 writers of the period, one of them being William Shakespeare, and he's the only one with no literary paper trail, which is you know, more than just a statistical blip, given that so many man hours, so much time, so much money has been put into trying to find, you know, if there was the evidence that tied him firmly enough to the works that we attribute to him, we wouldn't have any kind of authorship question. That's only why it exists. So to really believe thoroughly in the face of complete absence of belief is the same as any religious faith. You know, it's dogma, it's belief without proof.
Yeah, I can't quite go there, I'm afraid.
I'm not asking you to go there, but that there is something going on with Stratfordians too, as you say, sort of psychologically. There's something.
Can we at least
happening.
agree on this? Whether or not we say there's something. I mean, who here believes that the plays attributed to Shakespeare were all written by one man called William Shakespeare, who lived according to the dates that you're familiar with, etc., etc.? Hands up.
Oh, that's quite an interesting thing.
No, I'm not asking for a verbal retort. I'm just asking for a hand. We'll get you in a moment.
Count.
Seriously, do you all think that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare's plays? Muttering. Mixture. There's some. Who has any doubt about that? Who thinks that maybe, it's a convention.
Some of them are my friends, Will.
Oh, right. I mean, you only have to look at the way that Shakespeare is being co-opted to the Running and Jumping Festival on Stratford Marsh, which, you know, by any stretch of the imagination, he really doesn't belong to in any way, shape or form, to understand what kind of role he plays in nationalism as an anointed national poet, and that clearly is to do with dogma.
What is it about Shakespeare, or the doubting of Shakespeare, that gets people acting in this way?
Right.
It's still a mystery to me, Bill. I don't know why people get quite so angry about it.
Maybe we'll find out during the Q&A.
It is something about this. See, my feeling is, in a sort of fairly secular society, Shakespeare is now God, and it's like doubting God. It's like Darwin in the 1850s throwing a spanner in the works. It upsets something that we think we know and that we think is a fact. I mean, that's the reason why many non-Stratfordians, the first thing that happens is they're accused of being lunatics. So that, you know, oh, I suppose you believe in alien abduction as well, is something I get quite often. And I say, no, but I have been looking at the historical evidence, and I'm quite interested that there isn't evidence there that should be there. I come from a science background, and evidence is what I'm interested in, and how you join up dots of evidence and obviously make it, you know, this is a fabricated thing that I've joined the dots up here. I'm not saying that this is truth, but people have been quite exercised even about me writing a work of fiction about it. I think that the fiction itself is dangerous and I shouldn't be doing it.
And because there is remarkably little biographical information on the man called William Shakespeare, and I agree, not hardly anything that one might expect to tie him to the authorship of the plays, he has become a shape-shifting character that can be what people want him to be. Everybody can have their own personal Shakespeare. Everybody connects, you know, but I mean, the Shakespeare of Titus Andronicus doesn't really seem to me to be the same Shakespeare as the Shakespeare of the Sonnets.
It's very Marlowean, isn't he? The Shakespeare of Titus Andronicus.
Well, some might say.
You walked into that one, didn't you?
Perhaps I very kindly offered it up to my co-panelist. Might be a more refined way of looking at it. But you know, going back to what I was saying before, given that we locate a persona in a work, we don't know a great deal about who the person who wrote the work was, it then becomes possible, and I think the analogy with religion is not actually misplaced, for us all to have, you know, what you would call in religion an immanent Shakespeare in some way, a Shakespeare that speaks to us and to us alone, and who we kind of see in our own, or in an image of our own construction. I think the other thing, and I think you're right on this as well, Ros, is that in an increasingly secular age, and the kind of rise of Shakespeare, you know, coincides with a growing secular era. It does strike me that the texts themselves become actually like a revealed religious text. And while Shakespeare is kind of revered, and most of us have studied him to some extent or other at school, and those of us who are literate are aware of numerous borrowings from Shakespeare that crop up in the vernacular. The fact of the matter is, and I can only speak for myself here, that to read Shakespeare intensively and to understand it, think about, for example, something like the use of the play within a play structure in Act 4 of Hamlet, that is incredibly tricky language, and in fact it's a bit of a shibboleth Shakespeare in my view. Most people who if you called them to task and said, do you like Shakespeare, they say, oh, I love Shakespeare, I love Shakespeare. Most people who now study him in school, study him in standard editions with half a page of notes for every half page of Shakespeare text. The level of referentia that you require to matters late 16th and early 17th century, the density and complexity of the imagery and of the kind of Neoplatonic metaphysic that underlies a lot of the writing is well beyond the average and even the upper average contemporary reader. So what's going on there? What's going on is that an academic class has emerged over the centuries whose job rather like a rabbinical priesthood, is to interpret the revealed text to the populace. And nonetheless, their interpretation is itself a form of arcana, because most of us do not sit around reading secondary academic criticism on Shakespeare. So what you have here is what sociologists call an act of professional closure. Everybody's personal immanent Shakespeare collides with the necessity of academia to have a single author to justify the many, many man and woman hours they've put into writing their PhD theses and getting them published.
Would you say, though, that that's as we speak changing? What I mean by that is that has been the case, shall we say, that the academic class have, if you like, owned Shakespeare, let's say for the last 60 years or whatever. And maybe the Shakespeare authorship question and the people interested in it are a marker of the change that's happening. That's to say, a lot of independent scholars, non-academics, are in a way, if you like, challenging academic knowledge, and in many ways are typical for what's going on in our society, in that the traditional figures of authority are much more readily challenged, whether that's a doctor, whether that's a policeman, whether that's an academic. And that perhaps that part of the reason for academics getting so worked up about the Shakespeare authorship question is that they feel challenged, if you like, and that they're losing ownership of something that they regard as theirs. Saying it goes back, doesn't it, to the Borges idea of Shakespeare being everything and nothing. That's to say that people can find themselves in Shakespeare, or an idealized version of themselves, because he's everything in the works, but his biography, there is nothing in a sense. So the Shakespeare of Shakespeare in love is the Shakespeare we desire in many ways. That's to say, he's the Shakespeare of the works. The Shakespeare of the records, who was a businessman, a moneylender, a tax evader, hoarded grain during a famine, left his wife, you know where I'm going with that. The Shakespeare of the records is in many ways a Shakespeare that we don't really want. Doesn't it all come back to this idea is biography possible, if you like?
I think it's very, I mean, I didn't actually read all of it, but I looked at that book, The Lodger, which tries to extrapolate from quite a few legal records to find. And I didn't find it very convincing, because it seemed a linear extrapolation. A very interesting kind of counterexample, just to go wide with this one. When Hitler became Führer of Germany in the early 1930s, he went back and systematically destroyed the records of his early life, and particularly those of his kind of lost years in Vienna, making it very, very difficult for historians to actually get a picture of what Hitler was up to before the First World War. There's a very, very good work of history by a woman called Bridget Heyman, I think, called Hitler in Vienna. And what she did is what I kind of, you're going to tell me somebody's done it, but I think it's a much more interesting way to approach both the authorship and the biography question. Harder for a 16th century writer, but could be done. Which is that she went back and imaginatively created what a young man like Hitler would be doing in Vienna at that time. And in the process, she turned up a lot more biographical evidence by imaginatively inhabiting, figuring out what kind of things he would have seen, how he would have worked, what he would have worn, just from what circumstantial things were known. She then started coming up with more evidence again. Our problem with biography and with periodicity is how unknowable other eras are. So when we come to think about the identity of Shakespeare, and also when we come to think about the issue of Shakespeare's Catholicism, a book like Keith Thomas's Religion and Decline of Magic might be a better way into thinking about whether Shakespeare was a Catholic, in the sense that he was not a Protestant. I'm not saying he was a Catholic in terms of being a Counter-Reformation Catholic. By the same token, if we want to think about what Shakespeare was like in media res, maybe we're going around it the wrong way.
So in many ways what you're saying then, and this I think applies to your book, Ros, the most effective biography in many ways is fiction.
Yes.
Is this then, is it a novel in verse, or is it a biography in verse? Or is it both? And if it's both, what's the difference?
It's a fictional autobiography in verse.
Autobiography?
Well, it's written by Marlowe. It's written in the first person. It's his fictional autobiography, where he's telling his story of how it really was.
But of course, the person who it's really an autobiography of is you.
Of course. The line between biography and fiction is constantly crossed, and things that purport to be biographies have a fictional element. And in fact, I think the first paper that I wrote when I was doing my PhD was about, as soon as you introduce narrative, a fictional element necessarily intrudes. You're not just putting a bunch of artifacts and dates and places and here's some things, and you're joining the dots, and in the joining you create a narrative. You create, if you're a biographer, a coherent narrative for your subject, and as soon as you're telling a story about them, there is a fiction, you're taking a line out. That's why biographies are different. That's why you have so many Shakespeare biographies coming out every year, and they still sell, because they're telling slightly different stories, because they're spinning a new version of it. But you can't say that any of them are true.
You think of Richard Ellmann's biography of Oscar Wilde, or his James Joyce for that matter. I think he took it as a given that the narrative was a superimposition, and so used the exegesis of what we were calling the psychic biography as a way to kind of typify the life in that sense. It's debatable whether or not. Yeah, so narrative biography is always a construct in that way, but quite clearly it tells us something. Tells us something about who people were, and when the documentary sources are there, so for more recent biographies, then clearly they can tell us a lot. But I think it's always wise to be mindful about that problem. The canon attributed to Shakespeare is a dead weight on the English theatre and monopolises vast amounts of stage time. Everybody is trained to cope with this particular canon. And it becomes something of a ritual, clearly, to mount these plays and attend them. Were there to be some progress from the anti-Stratfordian position, it might, in some sense, undermine that kind of. It's another form of professional closure to some extent or other that may well be quite hinged on the authorship.
I just wonder whether, if there were some progress on non-Stratfordian ideas being more accepted, whether people might actually find more in the plays than is currently available. My reading through a Marlowe lens, which I was necessarily doing to research the book, added some very interesting layers to otherwise obscure themes.
Why did you decide the verse novel form?
The only authentic voice I know for Marlowe and Shakespeare really comes from the plays and poems, most of which are in iambic pentameter, so it seemed like an easy way to get a feel for something that could be authentically Marlowe or Shakespeare, while staying in 21st century.
Why did you write it, though, in 21st century?
Because I didn't want it to be. I think it's off-putting enough for people that it's written in verse. I didn't want.
So sales?
No, actually, that anyone would read it at all, because I wanted to make it understandable. I wanted to tell a story. I want people to actually be able to access that story. And I'm quite an accessible writer. I write quite accessible poetry because I don't like stuff that makes you feel. What it is, I don't like stuff that makes me feel thick. I don't like to read stuff that makes me feel stupid, and I don't like to put that kind of stuff out there for other people either.
Don't feel stupid, get even.
And I want it to be accessible. I want to tell the story. I thought it was a fascinating and potentially exciting story. James Bond in a codpiece. Didn't want to spoil it by making it impossible for anyone to get past page 1. I didn't want to make it like Ulysses, which hardly anyone I know has actually got to the end of. So that was it. And so you didn't want to make it like the most important novel of the 20th century? So sorry about that, Ros. No.
Which aspects of your story, narrative and character, did you take from the sonnets?
Well, I've got a dark lady in there, had to, really. I've got the Earl of Southampton being the fair young man. I have a huge part of it in lots of ways, because you can read the sonnets of what are called the sonnets of separation as sonnets of exile, travelling, into exile, sending letters home, not hearing from the person. All of that is in the sonnets. He talks about as victors of my silence cannot boast. So one of the reasons why silence comes up so strongly in that first thing is this idea of him being gagged. So actually a huge part of it. The sonnets came first because they are the part of the canon that feels most autobiographical. Like when I organised the structure of the book, it was really, a lot of it was through the structure of the sonnets. If Marlowe wrote the sonnets, he has to swing both ways. He has to be in love with both a young man and a dark lady at the same time. So it was essential that he wasn't... I mean, it's interesting because Marlowe's often seen as exclusively homosexual, coming from an era when there was no such thing. It's a nonsense, really, to think of him as gay. And we don't have any actual evidence that he was. There's obviously someone who badmouths him, Richard Baines, who's the person responsible for his death, if he died. At that point, he obviously died at some point. But yes, it's part of the whole complete blackening of his name that occurs afterwards, that he's an atheist, he's a sodomite, he's a pederast. And I wanted to challenge all of that. So I have him with liking women, liking men. It's really his beauty that he likes. He's just very, very attractive to beauty, and he doesn't mind too much what kind of package it comes in. A twin. The trouble a writer has, says Thomas Thorpe, breaking the local flatbread, it seems to me, is his writing calls to be attended to, yet he fears too close attention. Knocking snow off his boot, he snares me with a look that hints more information may be read therein, then fondly eyes the fire. Some travellers have gathered there to thaw themselves and drink, soaking the welcome heat. It is the eve of St. Stephen's night, and I feel more relieved to see Thorpe's face than I'd care to admit. There's something of interest to you. I've a tale of a man who was mistaken for another. London is talking now of William Shakespeare. A man who shares that name had come to town attempting to broker the sale of Stratford grain. The keeper of the inn where he is staying puts out the rumour that the famous author William Shakespeare is a guest of his. Oh God, just listen. So the word goes out, and a young man comes one evening to the inn and asks this merchant, Shakespeare, if he'll sign a copy of the book he wrote last year. A certain erotic poem, you may recall. But the man can hardly write. Don't second guess the tale before it's told, you'll spoil my fun. He takes the carafe between us by its neck, as though he holds a goose, and tops our cups with warm, spiced wine. So, takes a sip of his, devoid of urgency. This Shakespeare says, I'm afraid you have the wrong man. Honestly? He waves the youth away. But let me finish. The young man asks the tapster, is it true that the man in the snug seat, polishing off some tripe, is the author William Shakespeare? That he is, says the tapster, and as modest as could be. You'll never hear him boast it, but it's true. He says he isn't. Ah, the tapster says, folding his arms and chewing tobacco leaf, and there's your clue. Imagine you're mistaken for an author of genius. Would you not be tempted to soak up the praise and let the error pass? The youth agreed he would. There's half your proof. And might the actual author, shunning the gaze of an overzealous public, shy away from acknowledging his progeny? He might, the youth agreed. You peg him closely now, the tapster says. Look at his balding brow. The heat of the ideas inside that skull have burnt away his hairline. It was true, his hair was fast receding. See his hand, poised on the table, ready for a quill, the thumb and finger open. The student stares, then notices something awkward. Where's the ink? I'm sorry, says the tapster. Where's the ink? The pad of his middle finger should be black from pressing on a pen. The tapster stares to the middle distance, like he's watching wheat as it's harvested and stacked. Ah, yes, the ink, the absence of ink, You found the final proof. The man is such an expert at the craft, so practiced in the art of wielding pen, he never blots a word. The youth's convinced, and the tavern picks up custom from his friends as he spreads the word. Our gentle merchant packs, ready to head back to the countryside, where he can do his business unperturbed.
So let me just take the opportunity to say many thanks to Will Self for coming along this evening, and of course to Ros for writing such a wonderful book. Thank you very much.